The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the House of Representatives and our nation's capital, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to connect you today with Congressman Bobby Scott, representing the 3rd District of Virginia. Welcome, sir.
Good to see you, Woody.
Good. Tell us a little bit about your district, its geography, demographics, and how the economy is going there.
Well, this week, the district includes all of Portsmouth, parts of Norfolk, Newport News, Hampton, all of Surrey, Charles City, parts of Enrico, Richmond, Prince George, and all of Petersburg. Its economy is doing probably better than average. We have a lot of military presence in the Hampton Roads area. We just signed a new contract for another aircraft carrier, which means we'll have excellent employment at the shipyard for several years to come. The Richmond area is alive and well and growing, so I think the district is doing extremely well.
Great. Tell us a little bit about your background and experience. I know you served for a while in the Virginia General Assembly.
I served in the House of Delegates and the Virginia Senate. I was elected in '77 to the House and '82 in the Senate. Elected to Congress in '92, and have been serving in Congress since then.
And I think you're the first African-American congressman from the state of Virginia since Reconstruction.
John Mercer Langston served for about 6 months. He was elected. They withheld his swearing in, and by the time he got sworn in, he'd served a couple of months and then lost the primary. So he was only there a couple of months, but he was the only other African-American to have served in from the Virginia congressional delegation.
Now, was he instrumental in creating the Howard Law School?
Howard Law School and Virginia State University.
Great. You're on the Workforce Development Committee here in the House of Representatives.
The committee name is Education and the Workforce.
And you are the ranking member, meaning you are the most senior member from the Democratic side.
Right.
And tell us a little bit about the jurisdiction of that committee.
That jurisdiction, education part of it, early childhood education, elementary and secondary, higher education, workforce includes job training. Also includes a lot of other areas like the Older Americans Act, child nutrition, other nutrition programs. It includes juvenile justice, and that's one of the areas I've been working on, both on the Education and Workforce Committee and the Judiciary Committee. As a ranking member now, I no longer serve on any other committees. I just serve on the Education and the Workforce Committee. But it has a huge jurisdiction. Minimum wage comes under that, the National Labor Relations, Fair Labor Standards, the overtime, things like that. It has a tremendous jurisdiction.
So let's talk about workforce development, especially in terms of what's going on in your district, because we have a lot of youngsters who can no longer afford to attend our institutions of higher learning, and many of them are turning to our community colleges. Tell us why those community colleges are so important.
Well, first of all, it's one of the challenges we have. I think it is a sad circumstance now where young people are calculating that they cannot afford to go to a four-year college. You know, in the 60s and 70s, if you could get in, if you were academically prepared and applied and got in, there were very few schools you couldn't afford to go to. You could work a summer job, work part-time, get a Pell Grant, and come out virtually debt-free after 4 years of education. Now, you can work a full-time job and have very, very much of a problem coming out of college without a mortgage-sized debt. And a lot of young people are calculating that this real opportunity to move up in society is no longer readily available to young people unwilling to take on a huge debt. And we need to change that. The Pell Grants haven't kept up with tuition. The public colleges tuition has skyrocketed, both with general inflation in education, but also to a large extent, at least half of the increase is due to the fact that the states are not subsidizing the state colleges as they used to. It used to be that the state would pay for about 2/3 of the cost of a public college. Now it's about 1/3. That doubling essentially of what is on the student it explains a lot of why the tuition is so high. We need to get back to the point where we're subsidizing closer to 2/3 so that students can actually afford to go. When you limit the opportunity to a 4-year education, you're really limiting access to the upper ranks of society. If you look at the business leaders, if you look at the political leaders in society, virtually all, not all, but virtually all have a 4-year college degree. And that opportunity ought not be limited based on the zip code you live in or the circumstances of your birth.
And of course, there's been a lot of emphasis on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. So what are some of the opportunities that the Congress can pursue in order to ensure that youngsters have those kinds of opportunities?
Well, one of the things we're not doing is investing in research. That's a budgetary issue, and that's one of the things we've been working on. We're not investing the amount of money in research, in health research, in science research, NASA, and things like that, where people with a technical background can find opportunities. Now, those with the technical backgrounds are generally finding much better jobs than those in liberal arts. But we have an obligation to make sure those opportunities are available and to make sure that our society is moving forward. I mean, if you look at our international competition, if we don't have a highly educated workforce in a high-tech economy, information-based economy, people who have the technical backgrounds, we're not going to be able to compete in the international economy. We're not going to be able to, certainly not going to compete on wages. I mean, you know, we're not. There'll be people around the world who will work for lower wages than in the United States. We're not going to. You don't have to be near your customers or coworkers. You've got overnight deliveries, and you've got technology, cell phones, computers, internet, where if you can work across the hall from your coworker, you can really work across the globe. And so we need a highly educated workforce to make sure that we have that competitive advantage. So if a business is looking for somewhere to locate, they want to locate here because they'll know they'll get highly well-educated, well-trained workers. And if we start falling behind in education, and in fact we are falling behind, our posture in the international community will be at risk.
So what's the unemployment rate in your district compared to Virginia and the nation?
It's a little bit higher than the state in general, but it's competitive. I don't think it's as bad as the national rate because we have such a foundation. One of the challenges we have is that the area is highly reliant on the federal budget. In the Hampton Roads area, about half, it's been estimated almost half of the entire economy is dependent on the Department of Defense. Not federal spending, Department of Defense.
It's half of it.
Half. And that's the military spending, shipbuilding, military contractors. But in addition to that, you have NASA, Jefferson Lab, Energy Lab in Newport News. You've got FBI, you've got other federal spending, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, other kinds of federal money coming in, but half is Department of Defense. So when you start cutting back on the budget, you have a profound effect on the economy of Hampton Roads. And the problem with the budget, I've been trying to figure out why the budget is in such bad shape. And it's primarily because the people running the budget do not believe the tax cuts have anything to do with the budget, and the budget doesn't have anything to do with services. We had a train crash in Pennsylvania. The very next day, the majority in Congress voted to cut Amtrak's budget. There's technology that could have prevented the train crash, but we don't have enough money to have paid for it. And some trains had that technology. This one didn't. It wasn't in use, and so they cut the budget as if the budget didn't have anything to do with reducing the chances that another accident would happen. Tax cuts having nothing to do with the budget is actually part of the House rules. If you have a new spending plan, you have to show how you're going to pay for it. You either have to raise the taxes to pay for it or cut other spending to pay for it. If you have a new tax cut, you do not have to pay for it, as if that doesn't have anything to do with the budget. And when you've been led by people like that, obviously the budget's going to be in the ditch. We had one of the first votes I cast as a member of Congress in 1993 was on the Clinton budget, which raised taxes and cut spending and put us on a trajectory to paying off the entire debt held by the public. When President Clinton left office, after he left office, Chairman Greenspan was answering questions like, are we paying off the national debt too quickly? What will happen when there are no government bonds, when we pay it off the entire debt held by the public, which we were on course to do by 2008? I mean, people say, well, that's too big a deal. No, we were on track to paying it off. But you came in with people, massive tax cuts without paying for it, prescriptive drug benefit not paid for 2 wars not paid for, and then all of a sudden we're back in the ditch. You have to, we can do this, but you can't have an idea that tax cuts don't count. We passed a couple of years ago $3.9 trillion extension of tax cuts, as if it didn't have anything to do with the budget. Now we're trying to figure out what to do to pay for it. I mean, they're talking about Saturday mail delivery. 3.9 trillion. Saturday mail delivery is about 20 billion over 10 years. 3.9 trillion over 10 years, 20 billion. I mean, it's less than a rounding error. They're talking about cutting Pell Grants and increasing interest on student loans. They're talking about cutting Social Security. Now, but one thing you hear in this discussion, you don't hear in this discussion, are numbers. You know, the most frequently mentioned cut in Social Security is the change CPI, which, just to simplify it, cut the cost of living increase. That would cost about $125 billion over 10 years. That's how much it saves by whacking the cost of living increase. 3.9 trillion, 125 is about 0.1 trillion. Instead of a $3.9 trillion tax cut, why about a $3.8 trillion tax cut and leave Social Security alone? Those kind of decisions, that discussion never took place. They're so intent on doing the tax cuts first and then looking up and figuring out later how you're going to pay for it as if you'd never have to pay for it. We had a $1.2 trillion so-called sequester, across-the-board cuts.
Sequestration, yes.
10% across the board. Well, we passed $3.9 trillion in tax cuts and didn't do anything about the sequester, and now we're worried, oh, the sequester is going to be devastating. Well, we should have figured that out before we spent $3.9 trillion, but people are just so intent on thinking the tax cuts can be passed without paying for it that we end up in the budget mess that we're in today.
So I take it sequestration had an adverse negative impact in your district, because, well, especially the military.
Well, we have been kind of kicking the can down the road. We had about 1 year sequestration, and then Head Start students lost their seats. Just wreaked havoc with everything in Hampton Roads. We kind of had a deal where we kind of delayed it a little bit, but it's still looming. If we don't do something, it'll come back in and have the devastating effect on the Hampton Roads and 3rd District economy.
And of course, people talk about creating jobs, and of course, education is important. Transportation is equally as important, is it not?
Well, transportation, getting to the job is important, but transportation can create the jobs.
Right.
You know, I mean, people have no idea how big 3.9 trillion is. If you took 1/2 of a trillion and spent it on jobs for people that are drawing unemployment today, at 50,000 each, you'd run out of people drawing unemployment before you ran out of money.
Is that right?
You could hire everybody drawing unemployment for 1/2 of a trillion. We passed a $3.9 trillion tax cut, no jobs bill. I mean, it's just absolutely atrocious thinking. I don't know what the people were thinking when we passed it, but you know, they said I had to vote for the tax cut. No, you didn't. You could have done a jobs bill. You should have done that first. Transportation creates not only making able to get to the job, but just building roads and bridges. And we have trillions of dollars in unmet needs in roads and bridges. And when bridges fall apart, people wonder, well, what happened? Well, what happened was you didn't have any maintenance. The present budget we're dealing with essentially zeroes out any new transportation. We can hardly, the money that's coming in is barely enough to do maintenance. And if you've in Virginia, Hampton Roads, Northern Virginia, if you're sitting up in traffic jams, I guess well, we gave you a tax cut. This is just one of the things you got to suffer through in order to get the tax cut. Another area with jobs is what do you get paid? And minimum wage hadn't gone up for a number of years. We'd like to see at least a modest increase in the minimum wage. That would help those at the bottom. It would reduce the wage inequality. The wage inequality is becoming a national disgrace. I mean, we have, in terms of inequality of wages, the rich getting richer, poor getting poorer. By most measures, we do poorly on an international scale, rivaling some third world nations in terms of income inequality, where the top 1% has such a huge portion of the wealth. And it's gotten worse. We haven't raised the minimum wage in a long time. We have reduced the taxes on estates. The House, so that it used to be if you had, if husband and wife left $2 million, anything over that would be taxed. They moved it up to $7 million. Now they moved it up to $10 million. Just going from 7 to 10 in the money you can leave behind before it gets taxed was more than what they're talking about in Social Security. Again, like choices, so that dead multimillionaires can get a little tax relief. We're going to spend $135 billion, and I guess they say, well, we're going to pay for it by whacking everybody's Social Security. I don't know how anybody can explain that to their constituents, but that's essentially what we did.
So it sounds like there needs to be a lot of work done in a number of different areas. One thing that's pending, you did mention transportation, so there's the reauthorization of the transportation bill that's now pending, but still you have to deal with the appropriations. No one wants to raise the gas tax either, do they?
Well, you know, I think most people recognize that if you want new roads, you have to pay for them. You can pay for them with a gas tax, you can pay for them with an income tax or sales tax or tolls, but you have to pay for it. And I don't have any magic formula about how to pay for it other than you have to pay for it. And I know some of the people, we had a referendum in Hampton Roads to see whether we could raise the sales taxes to improve the transportation in Hampton Roads, and everybody kind of whining and they didn't want it. Okay, so they're going to fix the tunnels and impose tolls. Oh, we don't want tolls either. Well, no. You can't be against all. If you'd rather have tolls or rather have sales tax or rather have gas tax, that's fine, but you got to pay for it. And these people think you can be against all taxes and think you're going to have some new roads, just not being realistic.
Now, what about tax reform in and of itself? I know you worked for a number of years on the Budget Committee, and I'm sure there were a lot of discussions about the need for tax reform.
Well, tax reform depends on what you mean. If you mean cut everybody's taxes so that you don't have revenues, then that's one thing. But if you need revenues coming in, if you're going to have any education, if you're going to have any health care. I mean, we have a health care situation where the General Assembly didn't want to expand Medicaid. 400,000 people could get coverage. Actually, for the first couple of years, the general fund makes a profit. 30,000 jobs can be created. If we don't expand, rural hospitals will be in jeopardy. And to add insult to injury, if we don't expand your health insurance as a Virginia resident and my health insurance through a process called cost shifting, because people without insurance go to the hospital, don't pay, others have to pick up that cost, you're paying about $10 or $20 a month more every month. because the General Assembly didn't expand Medicaid. Now, there is no logical not logical justification for not expanding Medicaid. I mean, it's at most a 10% local state match. By the time you spent 90% of the money, the income taxes and the sales taxes generated would be enough to cover the 10%. And if we don't expand, then we are in a sense paying an extra tax that we shouldn't have to be paying because your policy is higher and my policy is higher. The Supreme Court is about to consider whether or not Virginia's citizens are entitled to the tax benefits. We would have to adopt a state plan so that we would be entitled to the coverage.
Those are the residents who are getting their services through the federal health exchange.
And everybody says if the Supreme Court says they're not denied those tax credits, it affects them. Let me tell you something. It will affect everybody,
right,
because everybody's policy will just skyrocket. And in fact, many insurance companies may just leave because they will have to provide the coverage at a set rate. You can't underwrite based on pre-existing conditions, and based on that, people will start waiting until they get sick before they sign up for insurance, and therefore the number of people insured gets sicker, and then some healthy people will drop out because they didn't get the tax credits and can't afford it, and the costs go up a little bit, and more healthy people come out. And there's a term for it. It's called a death spiral. The costs will spiral out of control when nobody can afford it. So if this Supreme Court rules that Virginia residents aren't entitled and we don't change to a state exchange, everybody will be in jeopardy. And so that's one of the upcoming issues. But the Medicaid expansion is just easy. We have billions of dollars that Virginia. You talk about economic development and jobs, billions of dollars not coming into Virginia for some reason because the General Assembly didn't want to take the free federal money.
Now, you mentioned the minimum wage and the need to raise it, and obviously the Congress is unwilling to do that. The President has done it, at least for federal workers, pursuant to an executive order. Seems like some of the states and localities now are deciding that they don't want to wait on Congress to act in terms of raising the minimum wage.
Well, some localities, and the minimum wage is way below poverty. Somebody working, we set a standard. If President Clinton would always say, if you work full-time, play by the rules. You should not have to live in poverty. So the minimum wage ought to be enough to get a family of three. The bill we've introduced is $12 by 2020, and that would get a family of three right up to the poverty level. And that's just a bare minimum. If you're working full-time, it's only fair in this society that you don't have to suffer in poverty. And education is going to make a difference in that. And, of course, education is so important for all aspects of life. I served on the Judiciary Committee, and we found that those who are well-educated aren't the ones getting in trouble with crime. And we're talking about doing a lot of talking about criminal justice reform, which should be getting a lot of attention in the next couple of weeks. I think people have concluded that mandatory minimums make no sense. They loaded up the prisons, waste the taxpayers' money, and we keep passing new ones. We need to put more money into prevention and early intervention. I've introduced the Youth Promise Act, which takes that approach, and by all analysis will reduce crime and save money. So that kind of approach in the criminal justice area is extremely important.
I also noticed you have a Death in Custody Reporting Act that you pursue.
Well, one of the things people keep talking about is that the discussion about the police shootings in Ferguson and in New York and South Carolina, nobody has the data. We did have the data. I introduced a bill 15 years ago that was signed, and we had for several years reporting, but by the time the report started coming in, it expired, and so we got it reinstated at the end of last year to require localities to report deaths in custody, not just police custody or in the process of arrest, but also jails and prisons The initial interest in this was a reporter who was trying to do a report about deaths in prisons. And there are no numbers. There's no cause. I mean, why are people dying in prison? Is it medical malpractice? Is it inmates killing inmates? Guards killing inmates? You know, it could be anything. Disease. It could be people who are sentenced to life without parole completing their sentence. But there's no analysis. And so the Deaths in Custody Reporting Act requires law enforcement just to report on a brief statement, somebody died, and a brief description of what happened, a little demographic data. And we hope that with this database, we'll be able to figure out nationally what's going on.
Now, I know that you had opposed originally the Patriot Act. Recently, the USA Freedom Act passed. Now, were you satisfied with the reforms that were made?
No, but it was an improvement over what was there. One of the problems we have is that law enforcement, the government collecting a lot of data creates a situation where people's privacy is just invaded. You saw what happened with Speaker Hastert. He was indicted on some bank charges. The government had information about some unsavory allegations and just leaked them. That had nothing to do with the bank fraud.
Right.
So the question occurs is whether you can trust government to keep secrets. Suppose they found an extramarital affair, one of the Republican presidential candidates. They're going to keep it a secret?
Of course not.
Well, they should. I mean, you know, so that's the question.
Right.
So when you start talking about getting all this data and background and phone records and license plate readers where they can keep track of everybody and find stuff, are they going to keep it a secret? And that's one of the problems. And another problem is you heard from the director of the just misrepresent the facts to Senator Wyden when he said, "Are you collecting massive amounts of data?" He said, "No." Well, that wasn't true. And we've had situations where the answers to questions were somewhat evasive. And so, you know, one of the things that one of the problems we have is whether or not you have confidence in the government getting all this data on people, keeping it secret, and what do they do with it? We decided on mass collection of data that the phone companies will keep it, and then you need a warrant to go get the information. I think that's better than the government keeping it. We'd like a situation where the government keeping it is better than the private companies, but we're not there yet.
Right. Bobby Scott from the 3rd District of Virginia.
Thank you, Woody.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association, connecting Virginians to their government. Till next time, I'm Woody Evans.